Elias Brady was 68 when the first sign appeared, though at the time he brushed it off as nothing more than aging. He was a retired carpenter, the kind of man who once built his own porch with nothing but hand tools, who prided himself on never asking for help. But over the past year, something had been gnawing at his sense of freedom. Nights that once brought rest had become broken, restless hours interrupted by repeated trips to the bathroom. Each time he rose from bed, he felt less like himself, less like the man who once laughed about drinking water before sleep. What used to be a joke became a burden, and in quiet moments, Elias wondered if his body was trying to tell him something he didn't want to hear. I remember when he first confided in me about it. We were sitting on his porch, the same one he had built 20 years before, the board still sturdy under our feet. He leaned forward, his hands rough and spotted with age, and he spoke with a hint of embarrassment. "It's not just the nights," he said softly. "It's the feeling of never being finished. I stand there, and it's like my body won't let go." There was pain in his eyes, not the sharp kind, but the dull ache of frustration. For Elias, dignity mattered more than almost anything, and this constant reminder of age, felt like an insult he didn't know how to fight. The turning point came one night when his wife, Clara, found him sitting on the edge of the bed, head in his hands after his third trip to the bathroom in just an hour. He looked older than his years in that moment, shoulders slumped as though he were carrying an invisible weight. Clara reached for his hand and he pulled it into his lap, whispering, "I don't think I can keep living like this." That was the first time he admitted out loud that something was truly wrong. For Clara, it was a moment of fear. For Elias, it was a quiet surrender. That night was the moment his journey began, even if he didn't know it yet. Elias had always believed that food was medicine, a lesson he'd picked up from his grandmother, who grew herbs and boiled roots into teas whenever someone in the family fell ill. But somewhere along the way, between raising 3 children and working long days in his shop, he started leaning on what he thought were healthier shortcuts. Fresh fruit bowls in the morning, citrus juices at lunch, watermelon slices in the summer afternoons. He told himself he was doing the right thing, that these choices were keeping him strong. Yet now, in the silence of his restless nights, he began to wonder if the very foods he trusted were quietly working against him. I could see how deeply this realization unsettled him. Elias was never one to complain, never one to show weakness, yet there he was, questioning every habit he thought was safe. His voice carried a mix of confusion and regret. "I thought I was doing better," he admitted. "I thought fruit was supposed to help, not hurt." It was more than just a question of diet, it was about trust, the kind of trust we place in what we eat, what we believe, and how those beliefs shape our health. When that trust cracks, it shakes a man to his core. But what struck me most was that Elias didn't let fear have the last word. He began to listen more carefully to his body, to notice how it reacted after each meal, each snack. He kept a small notebook by the kitchen table, jotting down how he felt after eating, even though his handwriting wavered more than it used to. At first he thought it silly, but soon he noticed patterns: a heavy night after citrus juice, an urgent morning after too much pineapple. Small connections began to emerge, and with them came a growing sense of control. What once felt like betrayal slowly turned into awareness. Clara became his quiet partner in this journey. She started preparing softer fruits in the mornings, ones less acidic, gentler on his system. She would place blueberries in a small bowl beside his coffee, watching as he ate them with a cautious hope. "Do you feel different today?" she would ask, her voice light but filled with care. Sometimes he shrugged, sometimes he smiled, and sometimes he confessed that, yes, it felt easier, calmer. These little victories mattered more than either of them could have expected. They were not cures, not miracles, but they were steps toward dignity, and for Elias, that was everything. I often think back to the day he told me, "It's not about giving things up, it's about choosing what lets me live in peace." That was the wisdom of a man who had faced his fears and decided to walk through them rather than around them. His nights became steadier, not perfect, but kinder. The sharp edge of frustration dulled into something softer, something manageable. For the first time in years, he began to talk again about small plans, the fishing trip he wanted to take with his grandson, the new chair he'd been sketching in his workshop. His body still spoke in whispers, but now Elias was listening, and that perhaps is the heart of his story. A man who once felt betrayed by his own choices learned that awareness is not punishment, it is power. By paying attention, by respecting what his body was telling him, He uncovered the quiet truth that not all foods are equal. Not all healthy things are truly kind. It wasn't about fear anymore. It was about learning, adjusting, and reclaiming a part of himself that he thought was lost. Elias Brady may have started his journey with shame and sleepless nights, but what he found along the way was something far greater, a path back to confidence, comfort, and the kind of peace that comes only when we choose to listen. When Elias Brady turned 68, he believed he had done nearly everything right. His mornings began with a bowl of fruit, his afternoons with long walks around the neighborhood, and his evenings with Clara, sharing simple meals at their worn but beloved oak dining table. He carried himself with the quiet pride of a man who had survived decades of hard work, raised children who grew into kind adults, and provided a home filled with laughter and safety. But somewhere in those routines, his body began whispering a different story, one he didn't want to hear. At first, it was only the nights that seemed different. A few years earlier, Elias could sleep straight through until morning, waking rested and ready to face the day. But now he found himself stirring at 1, then 3, then 5 in the morning, each time pulled out of sleep by the same need. It wasn't just the rising, it was the feeling that even after standing in the darkened bathroom, even after the flush and the sink's gentle creak, he hadn't quite finished. That quiet unease followed him back to bed, where Clara sometimes stirred and whispered, "Are you all right?" He always answered yes, though the word tasted like a lie. The turning point came on a summer evening when their eldest daughter, Marianne, brought over her children for supper. Clara sliced watermelon, piled it into bowls, and passed them down the table. The children devoured theirs with sticky smiles, while Elias took his time, savoring each cool bite. But that night, he woke 5 times, his rest shredded into fragments. By morning, he looked hollow-eyed, and Clara said gently, "Something's not right anymore, is it?" For the first time, Elias didn't deflect. He simply said, "No." I remember him telling me later that it wasn't the exhaustion that hurt most, but the betrayal. All his life, he had trusted food. His grandmother's garden had taught him that apples and pears, berries and herbs were nature's medicine. And yet here he was, older and more fragile, suddenly unsure of which foods were helping and which were quietly harming. That doubt shook him. "What if the things I thought were good for me are the very things pulling me down?" he asked. It was not just a question of diet, it was a question of trust, of identity, of who he had believed himself to be. Clara, ever the patient one, encouraged him to see his doctor. Dr. Hensley had known Elias for years and spoke with the warmth of a man who respected his patients as neighbors, not numbers. After listening carefully, Dr. Hensley leaned back in his chair and said, "Elias, sometimes even healthy things have their limits. The body changes as we age, and what once helped us can start working against us. The trick is learning to listen closely." Those words sank deep. Elias realized that his journey was not about throwing everything away, but about uncovering the hidden dangers that had slipped beneath his notice. From then on, he began to look at his fruit bowl differently. He no longer saw it only as a colorful display of health, but as a question mark. Each slice of pineapple or handful of grapes holding both promise and risk. He didn't stop eating fruit altogether. That would have felt like a betrayal of his grandmother's lessons, but he started paying closer attention. He noticed that on days when he ate citrus, he felt more urgency. When he snacked on grapes in the afternoon, his nights grew longer and more restless. It wasn't scientific, not at first. It was observation, intuition, the old wisdom of listening to one's body. His family noticed the change. Marianne, ever curious, asked one evening, "Dad, why are you writing in that little notebook?" Elias smiled, tapping his pen against the page, just keeping track, trying to learn what helps and what doesn't. She looked puzzled, but Clara's eyes softened. She understood. She had been watching the same patterns, noticing the same shifts. Together, they began making small adjustments. Blueberries instead of citrus, pears instead of pineapple. Nothing drastic, nothing that felt like punishment, only mindful swaps that respected Elias's dignity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the nights began to ease. Not every night, there were still evenings of frustration, but enough that Elias felt hope again. He no longer sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands, wondering if this was simply how the rest of his life would be. Instead, he started to believe that small changes, made with care, could bend the path toward peace. That belief gave him strength, not only for himself, but for the family who watched him with such concern. When he told me about it later, he used words I'll never forget. I thought the danger was out there, he said, some sickness waiting to strike. But it was right here, in the choices I didn't think twice about, the fruits I trusted without question. He paused, his eyes distant but calm. That's the hidden danger, not the illness itself, but the blindness, not knowing what's quietly working against you. That realization changed everything for Elias. It wasn't just about fruit anymore. It was about paying attention, respecting his body's voice, and making peace with the idea that aging requires adaptation. He no longer saw himself as a victim of his prostate or a prisoner of sleepless nights. He began to see himself as a man in dialogue with his body, a partner in his own health. And that shift, from helplessness to awareness, was the first and most powerful step on his journey. Elias Brady never imagined that turning 68 would feel so different from 67 or even 65. Birthdays had once passed with little notice, marked only by Clara's homemade cake and the laughter of grandchildren spilling across the yard. But now, each passing year seemed to sharpen the edges of his body's protests. The small discomforts that once faded quickly now lingered, and the late-night interruptions became a rhythm he could no longer ignore. For the first time in his life, he realized that age was not just a number, it was a new landscape, one that required him to walk more carefully than before. It struck Elias one afternoon as he watched his grandson sprint across the lawn, chasing a ball with uncontained joy. The boy was only 9, his legs moving like springs, his laughter carrying into the sky. Elias remembered a time when his own body felt that light, that free. He leaned on the porch railing, feeling the weight in his joints and the heaviness in his lower belly, and thought, I am not who I used to be. It wasn't sorrow exactly. It was awareness, a sobering recognition that men over 60 could no longer afford the same careless choices they once made. When he sat with Dr. Hensley again, the doctor put it plainly. Elias, men at your age live in a different season. What your body tolerated in your 40s or even 50s may now become a burden. The prostate, especially, has a way of reminding men that time has passed. It swells, it irritates, it demands attention. You can't brush it aside anymore. If you want to feel steady again, you have to listen more closely than you ever have before. Those words weren't harsh, but they carried the weight of truth. Elias nodded, not because he liked hearing them, but because he knew they were real. The idea that he had to pay extra attention settled into his mind like a lesson from his younger days. As a carpenter, Elias had always known the importance of detail. A crooked beam left unattended could compromise the strength of an entire house. In the same way, small choices now carried more weight. The fruit on his breakfast plate, the timing of a glass of water, the portion of watermelon at supper, these details, once unimportant, now stood between restless nights and quiet rest. Aging, he realized, was like building again, but this time he was crafting his own well-being. Clara noticed the change in his attentiveness. He no longer ate absent-mindedly, no longer grabbed a second serving just because it was there. Instead, he studied his plate as though it held answers to questions he hadn't asked before. You're thinking too much about food, she teased one evening, slicing pears onto a dish. Elias chuckled, but then his voice softened. I have to think about it now, Clara. I didn't before, and look where it's gotten me. She nodded, her teasing replaced by understanding. They were partners, and she saw how much he wanted to reclaim his peace. This new vigilance was not without its challenges. At family gatherings, when bowls of fruit were passed around, Elias felt the tug of old habits. Grapes, bright and sweet, called to him from the table. A nephew offered him a wedge of orange, and Elias hesitated, remembering the urgency it brought the last time. In those moments, he felt both the weight of discipline and the sting of loss. Yet beneath it all was a quiet pride. He was choosing differently, choosing with intention, and that gave him a sense of control he hadn't felt in months. One evening, as the sun set over the fields behind their house, Elias spoke to me about the loneliness of these decisions. It's strange, he said. When you're young, no one tells you that one day you'll have to negotiate with your own body. You think health is a given, something you'll always have if you just eat well enough, work hard enough. But now I see it's not that simple. Now every choice feels heavier. He sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Men my age can't afford to be careless anymore. We've used up our free passes. Yet with that realization came something unexpected, a sense of responsibility that didn't feel like punishment. Elias began to see his life not as a series of losses, but as an opportunity to practice care, the kind he once reserved for others. He tended to himself the way he once tended to Clara during her bout of pneumonia, or the way he carefully guided his children across the street when they were small. For the first time, he understood that caring for himself was not selfish. It was necessary. It was the only way to continue being present for the people he loved. Clara supported him in ways big and small. She swapped the orange juice in the fridge for a pitcher of pear-infused water. She filled the fruit bowl with berries, their gentle sweetness a safer choice. She even started reminding him, not in nagging tones, but in a voice filled with quiet love, "Remember, Elias, pay attention." Those 3 words became something of a refrain in their house, a soft reminder that the details mattered now more than ever. And Elias, though sometimes weary of the vigilance, found comfort in the rhythm of awareness. He no longer felt like a victim of his prostate's demands. Instead, he began to see himself as an active participant in his own story, shaping the outcome one careful choice at a time. The nights were not perfect, but they were better. The urgency was not gone, but it was manageable. And in those small improvements, he found hope, a reminder that even in the later chapters of life, transformation was still possible. In truth, that is why men over 60 must pay extra attention. Not because they are fragile, but because they are valuable. Because every year, every day, every moment is worth preserving. Elias came to see his body not as an enemy, but as a companion that required patience and understanding. And by paying attention, by respecting the signals it sent, he began to rebuild a kind of peace he thought he had lost forever. The first fruit that Elias began to question was one he had loved all his life: pineapple. It wasn't something he ate every day, but when summer arrived or when Clara baked her famous pineapple upside-down cake, he would always take a generous serving. There was something about its bright sweetness, its golden flesh, that felt like joy itself. For Elias, pineapple was not just food, it was memory. He remembered sharing slices at the county fair as a boy, watching juice run down his arms as he laughed with friends. Even in retirement, pineapple carried with it the taste of celebration, which is why it came as such a shock when he began to see it differently. One afternoon, Clara brought home a fresh pineapple from the market. She set it on the counter, and Elias immediately felt a smile spread across his face. He helped her cut it into chunks, the kitchen filling with that tropical, almost floral fragrance. They ate together, savoring the sharp sweetness. But that night, Elias woke 3 times before dawn, each time restless, each time carrying the same old frustration. By morning, his eyes were heavy, his steps slower, and Clara noticed. "It was the pineapple, wasn't it?" she asked gently. Elias hesitated, then nodded. It felt almost like betrayal to admit that something so joyful could turn against him. I remember him telling me later how conflicted he felt. "How can something so healthy be the cause of so much trouble?" he asked, shaking his head. The truth is, it wasn't just the sweetness, it was what his body was trying to say through the discomfort. Pineapple, with all its natural sugar and bold acidity, was simply too much for a system already on edge. Elias had always prided himself on resilience, on being able to handle anything, but his body was teaching him that age had changed the rules, and ignoring those changes only led to more suffering. Clara watched him carefully over the weeks that followed. When she served fruit, she offered gentler options: blueberries, pears, a slice of apple. Elias tried them reluctantly at first, still mourning the absence of his golden fruit. But as days passed, he noticed something. His nights grew steadier. He still rose once, sometimes twice, but not with the same urgency, not with the same feeling of being betrayed by his own body. For the first time in months, he woke one morning and said, "I feel rested." Clara smiled, her eyes wet with quiet relief. The doctor's words echoed in his mind. Dr. Hensley had warned him that some foods, though rich in benefits, could aggravate the prostate with their acidity or sugar. "It's not about good or bad," the doctor had said. "It's about what your body can handle now." Elias carried those words like a compass. It wasn't about cutting out pineapple forever. It was about listening, noticing, and respecting the signals. For a man who had built houses with precision, who understood the cost of ignoring a crack in the foundation, the lesson made sense. One Sunday afternoon, their daughter Marianne visited with her children. She brought a bowl of mixed fruit, pineapple chunks glistening among the strawberries and melon. Elias hesitated, staring at the golden pieces that once brought him so much joy. His grandson, unaware, pressed a forkful into his hand. Elias smiled, accepted it, and ate. The sweetness was everything he remembered, but that night he woke again, the restlessness returning like an unwelcome guest. In the morning, he made a decision. He told Clara, "No more pineapple for me, at least not for now." His voice was steady, not sorrowful, just certain. That choice was a turning point. It wasn't about denial, it was about dignity. Elias realized that letting go of one fruit was not the same as letting go of pleasure. There were other foods, other joys, and more importantly, there was the relief of quieter nights. By stepping back from pineapple, he gained something far more valuable than taste. He gained peace. It was a small sacrifice with a great reward, and that trade felt worth it. I saw in him a man who was beginning to understand that health at his age wasn't about clinging to everything he once enjoyed, but about choosing carefully, like a craftsman selecting the right wood for a chair. "Not every piece belongs in every design," Elias said once, half to himself, "and not every food belongs in my body anymore." He said it with acceptance, not bitterness, and that acceptance carried him forward. Weeks later, when the family gathered again, Marianne asked him if he wanted some pineapple. Elias shook his head, smiling gently. "No, sweetheart, that one's not for me anymore." The children looked confused, but Clara met his eyes across the table, her gaze filled with quiet pride. They both knew what that choice meant. It wasn't weakness, it was strength. The strength to honor his body's needs over his cravings, the strength to choose rest over restless nights. And that is how Elias began to learn the lesson of silent inflammation. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, it was quiet, subtle, creeping in the form of sleeplessness, urgency, discomfort. But once he recognized the connection, once he saw the link between pineapple and his nights, he could no longer ignore it. He chose awareness over ignorance, peace over indulgence. And in that choice, he found not only relief, but a deeper respect for the life he was still living. Elias had always associated pineapple with moments of lightness, never with heaviness. Its golden flesh had been a symbol of summer gatherings, of sweet endings to long meals, of his wife Clara's laughter as she spooned syrup over her cakes. But once he started noticing the patterns, the restless nights, the burning urgency, the hollow mornings, it became impossible to separate the fruit from the toll it seemed to take on his body. He was not angry with it. Food was never the enemy in his eyes. But he felt a quiet sadness, as though something once beautiful had slowly turned against him. Clara, ever observant, noticed how he hesitated whenever pineapple appeared on the table. She had always believed that joy in food mattered just as much as nutrition, and she didn't like the way his face grew distant when the fruit came out. One evening, she said gently, "You look at pineapple now the way you used to look at long days of work, like it's going to take something from you." Elias sighed, running his hand along the grain of the wooden table. "Because it does," he admitted. "It takes my nights, it takes my rest." His voice wasn't bitter but weary. It was the weariness of a man learning to accept that sweetness sometimes comes at a cost. What struck me, listening to him recount this later, was how personal the loss felt. To most, giving up a fruit might seem trivial. But to Elias, it was a small surrender in a life where so much of his identity was tied to resilience. He had weathered storms of all kinds, financial hardships, injuries in the shop, the ache of saying goodbye to old friends. Through it all, he had believed he could endure anything, but to realize that even a slice of pineapple could undo his dignity in the dark hours of the night, that humbled him in ways no storm ever had. Dr. Hensley explained it to him with a kind of fatherly patience. "Elias," he said, "pineapple is rich, not just in sugar, but in enzymes that can stir things up in your body. At your age, the prostate doesn't forgive as easily. What used to slide by unnoticed now lingers, irritates, inflames. It's not about fear, it's about respect. Respecting what your body is telling you." Elias nodded, taking the words in. He didn't feel scolded, he felt guided. And that guidance gave him strength to make peace with choices he once thought impossible. Clara began finding ways to fill the gap. Instead of pineapple, she prepared bowls of blueberries and pears, sometimes sprinkled with a little cinnamon. At first, Elias missed the sharp tang of his old favorite, but soon he found comfort in the softer flavors. They didn't carry the same sting, the same aftertaste of unease. One morning, after a night of unbroken sleep, he took Clara's hand across the table and said, "Maybe sweetness doesn't need to be sharp to be real." She smiled, squeezing his hand. Maybe it just needs to be kind. The grandchildren, of course, noticed the change. "Grandpa, why don't you eat pineapple anymore?" one of them asked during a picnic. Elias chuckled, his eyes twinkling with the humor he always found in life's awkward questions. "Because I've learned it's not as friendly to me as it used to be," he said. The child frowned, then popped a chunk into his mouth, unconcerned. Elias watched him with warmth, knowing that age changes everything. What nourished one body could harm another, and part of wisdom was knowing when to let go. But letting go didn't mean bitterness. If anything, it made Elias more grateful for the foods he could enjoy without consequence. He began to savor apples in a way he hadn't before, relishing their crisp gentleness. He took joy in the soft sweetness of pears, the way they yielded without protest. Each bite felt like a small reassurance that life still had plenty to offer. "I don't need pineapple to feel joy," he told Clara one evening as they sat on the porch. "I just need to feel peace in my own skin." There were still moments of longing. At church gatherings, when trays of fruit circulated, the golden chunks sometimes caught his eye. But Elias had learned something deeper than preference. He had learned the discipline of listening to his body, the courage to act on what he heard, and the humility to admit that even small pleasures could have hidden costs. That awareness, he realized, was not a punishment. It was a kind of freedom. For a man who once thought strength was about enduring without complaint, this was a profound shift. He discovered that true strength was not in pushing through discomfort, but in honoring himself enough to prevent it. He didn't see pineapple as forbidden, he saw it as a choice, one he could decline out of care for the life he still wanted to live. That mindset made all the difference. It wasn't about loss anymore, it was about preservation, of rest, of dignity, of the quiet joy of being able to watch his grandson's game without feeling drained from the night before. And so Elias carried forward, a man reshaped by something as simple as fruit. He learned that sweetness comes with a cost, but that the cost doesn't have to be paid if you choose wisely. The pineapple would always remind him of summer laughter, of cakes Clara once baked, of boyhood afternoons sticky with juice. But now it also reminded him of sleepless nights, of lessons learned, of the resilience found not in holding on, but in letting go. And in that balance between memory and wisdom, Elias found a new kind of peace. Elias used to think of sweetness and tartness as harmless pleasures, the little sparks that made food memorable. A slice of pineapple, a glass of orange juice, a handful of grapes, all of it seemed to belong to the language of health, the vocabulary of vitality. But once his restless nights began to point him toward patterns he could no longer deny, he started to notice something deeper. It wasn't just the fruit itself, but the way the acid and sugar played tricks on his aging body. One morning, after a particularly difficult night, Elias sat at the kitchen table with his small notebook open in front of him. He had begun writing in it weeks earlier, encouraged by Clara's gentle reminders. The page showed scrawled words: pineapple, restless, burning, orange juice, urgency all day, grapes, 3 wake-ups. It was like a puzzle coming together, one piece at a time. Elias frowned at the page, tapping the pen against his chin. "It's the acid, isn't it?" he murmured aloud. Clara, buttering toast nearby, looked over and said softly, "And the sugar." That combination, acid and sugar, was something Elias had never questioned in his youth. Back then, his body could handle almost anything without protest. But now, at 68, the rules had changed. His bladder felt tender after citrus, his nights fractured after too much sweetness. The realization stung because it wasn't about indulgence, it was about trust. He had trusted these foods as allies only to discover they could be subtle enemies when the years piled on. It made him think of old tools in his shop, once reliable, now too dull to do the job right. Nothing lasts unchanged forever. Dr. Hensley explained it in a way that Elias could carry with him. Acid can irritate tissue that's already sensitive, the doctor said. And sugar, whether it's from a candy bar or a piece of fruit, feeds inflammation. Your prostate is already prone to swelling. Together, acid and sugar just fan the flames. Elias nodded, but he admitted later that it wasn't the science that convinced him. It was the memory of too many nights staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that never came. The doctor's words only confirmed what his body had already been shouting. Clara began adjusting their meals without fanfare. She offered apples instead of oranges at breakfast, blueberries instead of grapes in the evenings, At first, Elias resisted, his eyes drawn to what he thought he was missing. But slowly, he began to feel the difference. The nights grew steadier, the urgency less sharp. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough. "Do you feel it too?" Clara asked one morning as he stretched in his chair. Elias rubbed his eyes, a faint smile forming. "I feel lighter," he said, "like I'm not carrying the same weight." The grandchildren didn't understand, of course. To them, fruit was simply fruit, colorful, fun, safe. At a family picnic, his granddaughter offered him a cup of fruit punch, bright red and fizzing. Elias shook his head gently. "Not for me, sweetheart," he said. She blinked, puzzled, but quickly returned to her play. He watched her run barefoot through the grass, thinking about how he too once drank without thought, ate without consequence. Aging, he realized, was not just about the body slowing down, it was about learning the price of things. Sweetness and acid had a cost, and it was measured not in money, but in dignity and rest. One evening, Elias confessed to me that what troubled him most was not the food itself, but the way it made him feel powerless. "It's like I can't enjoy what I used to without paying for it later," he said. His voice was heavy, but then he added, "But maybe that's the lesson. Maybe the trick is finding joy in different places, so the cost doesn't feel so high." That was the heart of his transformation, accepting that life still offered sweetness, just in new forms, gentler forms, if only he had the courage to seek them out. Clara played a large part in this shift. She began serving warm pear compote on cool evenings, the soft fruit filling the kitchen with a fragrance that carried no sting, no edge. Elias found comfort in it, a reminder that pleasure could be kind, not punishing. "This is enough," he said one night as they shared dessert. "More than enough," Clara smiled, her hand brushing his. It wasn't about sacrifice anymore. It was about discovery, new flavors, new habits, new rhythms of peace. And so Elias learned to see acid and sugar differently, not as villains, but as messengers. They weren't trying to punish him. They were simply revealing what his body could no longer carry. By paying attention, by respecting those messages, he regained something more important than indulgence. He regained control. His nights were still imperfect, but no longer haunted. His days were still cautious, but no longer burdened by confusion. Awareness gave him back the dignity that restlessness had stolen. As I listened to his story, I saw not a man defeated by age, but a man reshaped by it. Elias no longer lived in the shadow of sleepless nights. He lived in the light of mindful choices, each one a quiet act of care. Acid and sugar had taught him their cost, but also their lesson. That life after 60 was not about holding on to everything, but about letting go with grace, making room for what still nourished without harm. And in that grace, Elias found not loss, but a softer kind of sweetness, the sweetness of peace. For years, Elias began his mornings the same way. Before the sun fully rose, before Clara stirred from bed, he would shuffle into the kitchen, squeeze a few oranges, and pour himself a tall glass of juice. That ritual, bright and tangy, felt like health itself. He had seen it on commercials his whole life, heard neighbors call it the perfect start to the day. And so, without thinking twice, he made it part of his rhythm. The glass of orange juice was his quiet sunrise, the thing that made him feel ready for whatever the hours ahead might bring. But as his nights grew more restless, as sleep fractured into pieces, Elias began to wonder if even this cherished ritual was working against him. It was Clara who first connected the dots. One morning, as she washed dishes, she asked casually, "Do you think the juice makes it worse?" Elias frowned, defensive at first. "It's just juice," he said. But then he paused, recalling the burning urgency that often followed his mornings, the way he sometimes felt drained before the day had even begun. "Maybe," he admitted softly. "Maybe it does." He tested it without telling anyone at first. One week he drank his usual glass every morning, jotting notes in his little notebook. The following week he skipped it, choosing a pear instead or a bowl of blueberries Clara had left waiting on the counter. The difference startled him. On juice mornings he wrote words like tense, burning, and wake-ups. On juice-free mornings the pages were calmer, easier, steadier, better rest. He showed Clara the notebook one evening, sliding it across the table like evidence in a trial. She studied the words, then looked up with tears in her eyes. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew it was hurting you." The realization hurt, not because it meant giving something up, but because it meant letting go of a piece of himself. That glass of orange juice had been there through long years of work, through cold winters and hot summers, through the mornings when he doubted himself and needed a reminder of energy. Now, at 68, it felt like a betrayal. He told me once, "It's not just juice, it's the symbol of all the things I trusted, all the habits I thought were safe. And now I have to question even that." There was sorrow in his voice, but also a kind of strength, the strength of a man willing to face what was true. Dr. Hensley wasn't surprised when Elias shared his findings. "Citrus is tough on men with sensitive prostates," he explained. "The acidity irritates tissue already struggling. It's like pouring vinegar on a wound. It doesn't heal, it only inflames. And the sugar, though natural, still feeds the fire. You're doing the right thing by noticing. Your body is speaking, Elias, and you're finally listening." Those words, spoken with a doctor's calm authority, gave Elias permission to let go. What once felt like a sacrifice began to feel like wisdom. Clara made the transition gentle. She replaced the morning glass with bowls of softer fruits, sometimes slicing pears thin, sometimes adding a handful of berries with a spoonful of yogurt. At first, Elias missed the tang, the sharp wake-up of citrus on his tongue. But soon he noticed a new kind of awakening, mornings that began without the same urgency, nights that ended with longer stretches of peace. He found himself waking, rested enough to greet the day not with weariness, but with gratitude. That, he told me, was worth more than any glass of juice. Still, the pull of old habits lingered. At church gatherings, trays of orange slices often made their rounds. At family brunches, pitchers of juice sparkled in the light. Each time, Elias felt the familiar tug of memory, the longing for what once felt so normal. But then he would remember the nights, 3, 4 trips to the bathroom, Clara's tired eyes in the morning, his own frustration staring back at him in the mirror. The cost was too high, and so he smiled politely, declining the offer with a simple, "Not for me, thank you." One evening, as the sun dipped low, Elias sat on the porch with Clara, a bowl of blueberries between them. "It's strange," he said quietly. "I used to think strength was about pushing through, about proving I could handle anything. But now I think strength is knowing when to stop, when to say enough." Clara squeezed his hand, her eyes reflecting the golden light. "That's wisdom," she said. "That's what age teaches us." He nodded, the truth settling over him like a warm blanket. What Elias discovered in those months was not just about citrus, it was about the hidden costs of habits too long unquestioned. He realized that aging wasn't about giving up, but about adapting. It was about trading rituals that hurt for ones that healed, about learning that peace often comes not from clinging to the old, but from embracing the new. By letting go of orange juice, he gained something far greater: nights of steadier sleep, mornings filled with quiet energy, and the confidence of knowing he was no longer at the mercy of his body's protests. And so the glass of orange juice faded into memory, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. It had served him once, carried him through long years, but its season had passed. In its place grew a gentler rhythm, one that honored the man he was now, not the man he used to be. That shift, humble, quiet, deeply human, was the kind of transformation that carried Elias forward, one mindful choice at a time. Elias used to love the bright tang of citrus, a slice of lemon in his water on a hot day, a few orange wedges after Sunday service, even the occasional grapefruit Clara would cut in half and sprinkle with sugar. All of it seemed like the definition of freshness. To him, citrus meant cleansing, almost medicinal, the kind of food you ate to feel alive again after a heavy meal. But as the years pressed on and his nights grew troubled, Elias began to realize that not everything that feels refreshing is truly friendly to the body. The first time he noticed, it was subtle. He had squeezed lemon into his evening glass of water, a habit he picked up because someone once told him it was good for digestion. That night, he woke 3 times, each visit to the bathroom more urgent than the last. At first, he thought it was coincidence, just one of those unpredictable nights. But when it happened again and again, always after lemon water, he began to wonder. He wrote it down in his notebook, circling the word lemon with a heavy hand. Clara watched him carefully. She had always admired the way he paid attention to detail in his carpentry, and now she saw him applying that same care to his own body. "Do you think it's the lemon?" she asked gently one morning as she placed a bowl of oatmeal on the table. Elias sighed. "I don't want it to be," he admitted, "but I think it is." His voice carried both disappointment and resignation, as though admitting it meant losing something small but cherished. Dr. Hensley confirmed his suspicion during a routine checkup. Acidic fruits like oranges and lemons can irritate the bladder and prostate, Elias, he explained. They may feel refreshing, but inside they can stir up more trouble than you realize. Elias nodded slowly, the truth settling like a weight on his chest. It wasn't just the juice anymore. Even a squeeze of lemon, even the smallest indulgence, could tip the balance. And suddenly, the things that once symbolized health began to feel like hidden traps. The hardest part for Elias wasn't the physical discomfort, it was the sense of betrayal. Oranges had been a part of his childhood. He remembered peeling them on long car rides, the zest filling the air, sticky juice dripping down his fingers. Lemons reminded him of Clara's iced tea on summer afternoons, served with laughter and the clink of ice cubes in tall glasses. To give them up felt like erasing pieces of his life, tiny rituals woven into the fabric of his days. It's strange, he told me once, how something so small can carry so many memories, and how hard it is to let go. Clara, ever the partner in his journey, tried to soften the loss. She swapped citrus with pears in her tea, sliced apples instead of oranges for their morning table, and filled bowls with berries when guests came over. At first, Elias ate them with hesitation, tasting not just the fruit, but also the absence of what used to be. But soon he began to notice the difference, not just in his nights, but in his spirit. The urgency softened, the restlessness eased, and slowly he began to accept that letting go of citrus was not the end of joy, but the beginning of peace. One Sunday after church, a friend offered him an orange wedge. Elias smiled politely and declined. The man looked surprised. "You don't like oranges anymore?" he asked. Elias hesitated, then answered with quiet honesty. "I do, but they don't like me." The friend laughed, not understanding, but Clara's hand found his under the table. She understood perfectly. It wasn't about taste, it was about dignity, about the right to rest without constant interruption. The grandchildren noticed too. "Grandpa, why don't you eat oranges with us?" one of them asked. Elias knelt down, his rough hands resting on the child's shoulders. "Because my body tells me not to," he said simply, "and I've learned it's important to listen." The child nodded solemnly, as though accepting a lesson bigger than he could fully understand. In that moment, Elias realized that his journey wasn't just for himself. It was teaching his family too, that health is not about stubbornness, but about humility. The more he leaned into that humility, the freer he became. Instead of feeling bitter about what he had lost, he felt grateful for what he had gained. Calmer nights, fewer trips in the dark, mornings where his energy belonged to him again. "It's not about what I can't eat," he told Clara one evening as they shared a bowl of blueberries on the porch. "It's about what I can enjoy without fear," she smiled, brushing her hand over his. "And that's worth more than any orange." Elias still missed the brightness of citrus sometimes, the way it cut through the heaviness of a meal, the sharpness that made him feel awake. But he no longer felt pulled toward it in the same way. He had learned to see oranges and lemons not as enemies, but as old friends whose company he could no longer keep. The memories remained sweet, but the present demanded something gentler, and in choosing gentleness, Elias found strength. If there was ever a fruit Elias trusted without question, it was the banana. It had been his companion since boyhood. An easy snack tucked into a lunch pail, a quick bite before heading out to the fields, a staple for his children when they were small and hungry between meals. Bananas felt safe, dependable, almost ordinary in the best way. They were comfort food, not indulgence. When other fruits seemed extravagant, the banana was simple, humble, always within reach. Even as his prostate troubles grew harder to ignore, Elias leaned on bananas as if they were an ally. He liked how they filled him without heaviness, how their soft sweetness carried none of the sting that citrus or pineapple brought. "At least bananas don't fight me," he said to Clara one morning, peeling one over his oatmeal. She nodded, not wanting to break the comfort of his belief. But deep down, she noticed the same patterns he had yet to accept. The days when his swelling felt worse, the nights when his rest grew more broken after he had eaten more than one. It was Dr. Hensley who finally gave words to what Elias was reluctant to admit. During one of their checkups, the doctor leaned forward and said gently, "Bananas aren't always as harmless as they seem. Too many can alter fluid balance, and with your prostate already sensitive, that extra pressure doesn't help." Elias frowned, almost offended. "Bananas?" he repeated. "Of all things?" He shook his head, struggling to accept that something so ordinary, so woven into his daily life, could be part of the problem. That evening, Elias sat on the porch with a banana in hand, turning it over like a puzzle he couldn't solve. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered. "How could this soft little thing be an enemy?" Clara placed her knitting aside and said quietly, "Maybe it's not an enemy. Maybe it's just not the friend you thought it was." Her words struck him. He looked at the fruit again, realizing that trust in food wasn't about absolutes, but about timing, balance, and listening. Elias began paying closer attention. When he ate one banana in the morning, he felt fine, but when he reached for a second in the afternoon, the nights grew heavier, more restless. It wasn't immediate, but it was consistent. His notebook filled with notes, 1 okay, 2 not okay. The pattern was undeniable. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to cut back. It wasn't about giving them up completely, he still enjoyed their comfort, but about finding the line where comfort ended and trouble began. Clara supported him with gentle creativity. She added apple slices to his oatmeal instead of a second banana. She offered pears in the afternoon, their mild sweetness easing the gap. At first, Elias missed the familiar texture, the convenience of reaching for what he knew. But soon he noticed something greater, the nights easing, the urgency softening. He began to wake with more steadiness, less frustration. "Maybe you're right," he admitted to Clara one morning. "Maybe bananas aren't enemies, but they can be trouble if I let them." The grandchildren, as always, were curious. "Grandpa, why don't you eat as many bananas anymore?" one asked, holding one in his small hands. Elias smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "Because my body told me I don't need so many," he said. "One is enough." The child shrugged, satisfied with the answer, and returned to peeling his fruit. Elias watched him, thinking about how easy it had once been to live that way, without thought, without consequence. Now every choice mattered, every piece of fruit carried weight, yet what could have felt like a burden began to feel like empowerment. Elias no longer ate blindly, he ate with awareness, with a kind of respect he had never given his body before. That awareness spilled into other parts of his life too, the way he noticed how water late at night affected his rest, the way he measured his steps on longer walks. It wasn't fear driving him, it was wisdom, the quiet knowledge that life after 60 was about tuning in, not pushing through. One night, as we sat talking, Elias reflected on the change. "Bananas used to feel like comfort," he said, "and they still do, but comfort without awareness is just habit. Comfort with awareness, that's real peace." His words carried the weight of a man who had learned that even the simplest things can surprise you, that nothing is too ordinary to be questioned. Bananas hadn't betrayed him. They had simply revealed a truth he hadn't seen before, that even comfort foods have limits, and that caring for himself meant respecting those limits. By choosing moderation, by listening, Elias turned what once seemed like an enemy into a lesson, a teacher disguised in yellow skin. And that lesson carried him forward, one thoughtful bite at a time. Elias had always thought of potassium as a blessing. Doctors praised it for keeping blood pressure steady, for helping muscles and nerves work as they should. Bananas, potatoes, spinach. He had heard for years that these foods were good for him, almost necessary as part of a balanced diet. And for much of his life, he never questioned it. But now, in the shadow of restless nights and the stubborn weight of his prostate troubles, he began to see that even blessings can have a darker side. It started one evening after supper. Clara had baked potatoes, sprinkled lightly with salt, and Elias had eaten heartily, enjoying their warmth and comfort. Later that night, however, he felt the same old swelling, the pressure that sent him stumbling back and forth to the bathroom. In the morning, Clara raised her eyebrows knowingly. "It wasn't the pineapple this time," she said. Elias sighed, rubbing his temples. "No," he admitted, "but something's still stirring me up." He brought the notebook with him to his next appointment with Dr. Hensley. The doctor studied Elias's careful notes, lists of foods, restless nights, moments of ease and discomfort. "You've done good work here," Hensley said with a smile. Then he pointed to one entry. 2 bananas, bad night. Another, potatoes at dinner, urgency. The doctor leaned back. "Elias, potassium is essential, but too much can upset the balance of fluids in your body. For younger men, it's usually no trouble. But as kidneys age, they don't handle excess as well. That fluid can linger, pressing on your already sensitive prostate." Elias sat quietly, absorbing the words. So even something that's supposed to help me can hurt me now? The doctor nodded gently. That's the truth of aging. Nothing stays simple. It doesn't mean you give it up altogether. It just means you learn where your limits are. Elias thought about that on the drive home, the quiet hum of the truck filling the space where his mind tried to sort through the new reality. Potassium, once an unquestioned ally, was no longer so straightforward. That night, Elias spoke with Clara about it on the porch. The summer air was warm, cicadas buzzing in the trees. I always thought food was either good or bad, he said. But it's not that simple, is it? Even good things can turn if you're not careful. Clara squeezed his hand. Maybe it's like building a house, she said softly. Too much of one material, even a strong one, can make the whole structure weak. Elias smiled faintly. She always had a way of grounding things, of making the complicated feel clear. He began experimenting, this time with potassium-rich foods. Instead of 2 bananas, he ate 1. Instead of a whole baked potato at dinner, he split it with Clara and filled the rest of his plate with green beans. The difference, though small, was noticeable. The nights weren't perfect, but they were kinder. The pressure eased, the urgency softened. Maybe the trick is not removing, but reducing, he said one morning, stretching after a longer than usual sleep. Clara nodded, sliding a plate of sliced pears in front of him. That's what balance means, Elias. Not all or nothing, just enough. The grandchildren, as always, were curious. One afternoon, Elias shared a banana with his grandson, peeling it in halves. "Why don't you eat the whole thing, Grandpa?" the boy asked. Elias chuckled. "Because my body tells me half is enough." The child blinked, then nodded solemnly, accepting the answer as if it were a secret rule of adulthood. Elias smiled, realizing that even in small ways, his journey was teaching the next generation something about listening to themselves. What surprised Elias most was not the change in his nights, but the change in his heart. For so long, he had fought against his body, frustrated by its betrayals. But now, with each adjustment, he began to see it differently. His body wasn't an enemy, it was a messenger. The potassium wasn't out to harm him, it was simply revealing limits he hadn't acknowledged. And in respecting those limits, Elias felt less like a victim and more like a partner in his own well-being. He told me once, with a thoughtful look in his eyes, "I used to think strength was about taking everything in, about never saying no. But now I think it's about knowing when to stop, even with something as simple as a banana or a potato. That's where the real strength lies, in saying enough." His words carried the weight of a man who had built houses and raised children, who had given his life to others. Now he was learning, perhaps for the first time, to give the same care to himself. The dark side of potassium wasn't a curse, it was a reminder that age demands attention, that wisdom is found in balance, and that dignity is preserved not by clinging to the old ways, but by adapting to the new. Elias embraced that truth quietly, with the same steadiness he once brought to his carpentry. And in doing so, he found something greater than comfort. He found peace, one mindful choice at a time. Elias had always thought of hormones as something belonging to younger men. Teenagers with their restless energy and quick tempers, young fathers, their strength running like fire through their veins. To him, hormones were a thing of the past, a tide that had risen in his youth and receded as the years went by. But as his prostate troubles deepened, as nights grew restless and mornings heavy, he began to realize that hormones were not gone. They had simply changed, shifting beneath the surface in ways he had never expected. It was Dr. Hensley who first put the thought into words. During a quiet visit, after Elias explained how certain foods seemed to weigh heavier on him now, the doctor said, "Your body is still full of hormones, Elias. They don't disappear, they just change. And even small shifts, something as simple as a plant compound in fruit, can tip the balance." Elias frowned, puzzled. "Fruit?" he asked. "Like bananas?" The doctor nodded. "Even bananas. They contain plant sterols, tiny things that, in your younger years, wouldn't matter much. But now, when your testosterone is lower and your system more delicate, they can add to inflammation." The words unsettled Elias. A banana had always seemed the gentlest of foods, soft, sweet, harmless. The thought that it carried something that could interfere with his hormones felt almost absurd. That night, he sat on the porch, a banana in his hand, staring at it as though it were something unfamiliar. "How can something so simple be so complicated?" he muttered. Clara, sitting beside him with her knitting, glanced up. Because your body is complicated, she said softly, and it changes, even when we wish it wouldn't. For days afterward, Elias thought about those shifts. He remembered the man he once was, the strong arms that could lift beams without effort, the voice that carried through his workshop, the confidence that came from feeling his body answer without hesitation. Now, at 68, he felt different. Not weaker exactly, but changed, as though the foundation had settled over time. He understood now that hormones weren't just for the young. They were threads woven through every stage of life, and when they frayed, the whole fabric shifted. The bananas became a symbol of that change. Where once he ate them without thought, now he measured each one carefully. One in the morning, no more. Never in the evening, when his body seemed less forgiving. Clara helped, offering pears or apples in the afternoons, finding ways to ease the gap without making him feel deprived. Slowly, Elias began to see that moderation wasn't loss, it was wisdom, and in that wisdom, he found a kind of freedom. He explained it to his grandson one afternoon. The boy had offered him a second banana, eager to share. Elias shook his head gently and said, "One is enough for me." The child looked confused. "But why?" Elias smiled, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Because my body has changed and I have to listen to it. That's how I stay strong." The boy's eyes widened as though hearing a secret meant for older men. In that moment, Elias realized he wasn't just learning for himself, he was teaching, too, passing on lessons about respect and awareness. The changes weren't just physical. Elias found himself reflecting on what it meant to age, on how the quiet shifts of hormones mirrored the quiet shifts of life. "When I was younger, I thought strength was permanent," he told me one evening. "But it's not. It moves, it changes, just like hormones do. And maybe that's not weakness. Maybe it's just another season we're meant to live through." His voice carried no bitterness, only acceptance, as though he had finally made peace with the ebb and flow of time. Clara saw the difference in him. She noticed that he no longer fought his body, no longer grew angry at the limits it imposed. Instead, he moved with it, adjusting, respecting, finding balance where once he demanded control. "You seem calmer," she told him one night as they sat together. Elias nodded. "Because I finally stopped treating my body like an enemy," he said. "It's just trying to tell me what it needs. I only had to start listening." And so, bananas became more than just food. They became a reminder of the delicate dance between age, hormones, and health. They taught Elias that even the simplest things carry layers of complexity, and that wisdom is found not in denial, but in awareness. By honoring those shifts, by respecting the ways his body had changed, he discovered that aging was not about losing power, it was about finding new forms of strength. In the end, Elias learned that the true danger was not the banana itself, nor the hormones shifting quietly within him. The danger was in ignoring the signs, in refusing to adapt. By paying attention, by embracing moderation, he found not only steadier nights and calmer mornings, but also a deeper sense of dignity. And in that dignity, he uncovered the quiet truth, that even as hormones turn and bodies change, life still offers peace, if only we are willing to listen. For Elias, watermelon had always been a symbol of summer's joy. He remembered biting into its pink flesh as a boy, the juice running down his chin while the sun beat on his shoulders. Later in life, it became the fruit of family picnics and porch gatherings, a treat that carried laughter in every slice. Even now, at 68, the sight of a chilled watermelon on a hot day stirred something light and hopeful in him. It was the taste of youth, of freedom, of life without complication. But like so many things in his later years, even watermelon began to reveal a hidden price. One July afternoon, Clara cut a large melon and filled bowls for the grandchildren. She placed a generous portion in front of Elias, who smiled and accepted without hesitation. He ate slowly, savoring the crisp sweetness, watching the children run barefoot in the yard. For a moment he felt transported, as though time itself had softened. But that night his body told another story. He rose from bed again and again, the fullness in his bladder pressing with urgency. By morning he was hollow-eyed, his body heavy with fatigue. Clara studied him across the breakfast table and asked softly, "It was the watermelon, wasn't it?" Elias sighed, reluctant to admit it. "It shouldn't be," he said. "It's just water and sweetness. How could something so refreshing make me feel so worn?" Clara didn't answer, only reached across to squeeze his hand. He saw in her eyes the same truth he was trying to resist. What once nourished now carried a hidden burden. Watermelon, with its 90% water content, was flooding a body that no longer kept pace. The prostate, swollen and stubborn, pressed against his bladder, leaving no room for the surge of fluid. What had once quenched his thirst now stole his rest. He wrote it in his notebook. Watermelon at night, 5 wake-ups. The numbers told a story he couldn't ignore. And yet, letting go of watermelon felt harder than he expected. It wasn't just food, it was memory. To deny it felt like cutting ties to summer evenings on the porch, to Clara's laughter, to the sticky-fingered joy of his grandchildren. He confessed to me one afternoon, "It's not the fruit I miss, it's what it stands for, and giving it up feels like losing a part of myself." Dr. Hensley listened with quiet patience when Elias shared his struggle. "You don't have to give it up entirely," the doctor said, "but timing matters. If you eat it earlier in the day, your body has time to handle the extra water. It's those evening slices that push your nights into chaos." Elias nodded, relief softening his face. It wasn't about saying goodbye forever, it was about learning to place things where they belonged. So Elias experimented. He ate a small bowl of watermelon at lunch, savoring the sweetness while the sun was still high. That night, he rose only once, the rest of his sleep uninterrupted. The difference felt miraculous. He woke rested, his steps lighter, his spirit brighter. "Maybe it's not watermelon itself," he told Clara with a smile. "Maybe it's just when I let it in." She laughed gently, glad to see the burden lift. Still, there were moments of temptation. At evening gatherings, when the grandchildren carried slices like trophies, Elias sometimes felt the ache of old habits. The cool sweetness called to him, whispering promises of refreshment. But then he would remember the long nights, the weariness in Clara's eyes, the hollow mornings. With quiet discipline, he would shake his head, saying softly, "Not tonight." It was a small phrase, but each time he spoke it, he felt stronger, more in control of the life his body still allowed him to live. The grandchildren, of course, noticed. "Grandpa, why don't you eat watermelon with us at night?" one of them asked. Elias crouched down, looking into the child's curious eyes. "Because my body asks me to rest at night," he explained, "and watermelon keeps me awake, so I save it for the day." The child nodded thoughtfully, as though filing away a lesson for the future. In that moment, Elias realized that his journey wasn't just about him, it was shaping the way his family understood care and respect for the body. What surprised him most was not the difficulty of saying no, but the peace that came from saying it. Each time he chose rest over indulgence, he woke with more clarity, more patience, more energy to spend with the people he loved. He discovered that joy didn't vanish when he declined a slice of fruit. Joy appeared in other places, in the laughter of his grandchildren, in the warmth of Clara's smile, in the quiet dignity of nights uninterrupted. Watermelon hadn't betrayed him. It had simply reminded him that even the gentlest pleasures must be handled with care. Aging, he realized, was not about losing the right to enjoy, it was about learning the right way to enjoy. Timing, moderation, awareness, these became his tools, the way he rebuilt peace in his nights. And with each choice, he felt less like a man at the mercy of his body and more like a partner in its care. So watermelon remained in his life, but no longer as a reckless indulgence. It became a midday treat, a reminder that sweetness was still possible if he respected his body's limits. Elias carried that truth like a carpenter's square, guiding each cut, each choice with precision. And in that careful balance, he found the kind of freedom he thought was gone forever. The freedom to live not in fear of the night, but in gratitude for the day. Elias had always believed that drinking more water was the safest thing a man could do. For years, he carried a thermos to his shop, refilling it through long afternoons of sanding and sawing. Even in retirement, Clara often reminded him to stay hydrated, a phrase their children had picked up from health articles and passed along like gospel. So when he ate watermelon or poured himself an extra glass of water before bed, he thought of it as a kindness to his body. But his body, older now, had begun to tell him a different story, one he could no longer ignore. It was one August evening that drove the point home. The day had been sweltering, the kind of heat that clung to the skin long after sunset. Elias drank glass after glass of water, grateful for the coolness. Later, Clara offered slices of watermelon, and he ate without hesitation, believing he was nourishing himself. Yet when he lay down to sleep, peace never came. He was up within the hour, again and again, his bladder refusing to let him rest. By dawn, he had lost count of the trips down the hallway. His body felt heavy, his spirit worn thin. Clara looked at him with worried eyes and said softly, "Too much, Elias. You gave your body more than it could hold." He wrote it in his notebook the next morning, "Excess water, your long night." The words unsettled him. All his life, water had been a friend. To think it could now be part of his struggle felt almost unfair. "Even water?" he asked aloud, his voice heavy with disbelief. Clara placed her hand over his, steady and warm. "Even water," she said. "Your body isn't the same as it was, love. It can't carry what it once did." At his next visit, Dr. Hensley explained it plainly. "Elias, hydration is important, but your bladder and prostate are under strain. Imagine pouring water into a cup that already has a crack. It doesn't hold the same. At your age, extra fluids, especially at night, overwhelm the system. Your prostate presses on the bladder, and the bladder can't empty fully. So the more you pour in, the more restless your nights will be." Elias listened quietly, nodding. The doctor's words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. He realized that what had once been good in abundance was now best handled with care. That evening, he spoke with Clara on the porch, the sky painted in fading streaks of gold. "I feel like I'm learning to live all over again," he said. "What used to help me now hurts me, even water, even something so simple." Clara leaned against his shoulder, her voice soft. "Maybe it's not about less or more," she said. "Maybe it's about timing." He thought about that for a long while, the idea that life after 60 was not about denying, but about arranging things differently. So Elias began to shift his habits. He drank his largest glasses of water in the morning, sipping steadily through the afternoon and slowing down as evening drew near. When Clara offered watermelon, he enjoyed it at lunch instead of supper. The changes were small, but the results were undeniable. His nights grew calmer, his mornings less hollow. The notebook reflected his progress. Afternoon watermelon, 1 wake-up. Less water at night, slept through. Each entry carried with it a growing sense of control, a quiet victory. One Sunday after church, a neighbor teased him for declining a second cup of iced tea. "Since when do you turn down tea, Elias?" the man chuckled. Elias smiled, steady and sure. "Since my nights became more important than my habits," he replied. The words surprised even him. They weren't spoken in regret, but in strength. He wasn't giving up something, he was choosing something greater. And that choice gave him back dignity he thought he had lost. The grandchildren, ever watchful, asked questions too. "Grandpa, why don't you drink lots of water at night?" one of them asked. Elias knelt down, his hand resting on the child's shoulder. "Because my body needs rest more than water then," he explained. "I give it what it needs in the day so it can be quiet at night." The child nodded, satisfied with the answer, and Elias felt a small swell of pride. He wasn't just adjusting for himself, he was showing them what it meant to live wisely with age. What struck me most as Elias shared his journey was the peace that came with awareness. Once, he had felt betrayed by his own body, confused by nights that unraveled without warning. But now, with each mindful shift, he began to see a pattern. His body wasn't punishing him, it was teaching him. Too much fluid, too late, was simply a lesson in limits. By respecting those limits, he found not loss, but freedom. The freedom of quieter nights, of mornings where he could meet Clara's eyes without weariness, of days where he felt more like himself again. And so Elias came to understand the truth about fluids in his later years. They were still necessary, still nourishing, but no longer limitless. They had to be guided, timed, respected. Watermelon was still sweet, tea still comforting, water still essential, but only when placed in the right part of the day. In learning that balance, Elias reclaimed something he thought had slipped away forever: the dignity of rest, the comfort of control, and the steady rhythm of a life lived with care. Grapes had always been one of Elias's quiet pleasures. Unlike pineapple or watermelon, they didn't demand attention. They were simple, bite-sized comforts, something to pluck from a bowl during an afternoon conversation, or to share with the grandchildren on the porch when the day was long and the sun lingered. To Elias, grapes carried a sense of innocence. They felt harmless, almost too small to matter. Yet, as he would come to learn, even the smallest pleasures could cast the longest shadows on his nights. It happened gradually. Clara often kept grapes in a colander on the counter, washed and ready for anyone passing by. Elias would eat them without thinking, 5 here, a handful there, another after supper. Their sweetness was gentle, and their ease made them feel like the perfect snack, but the pattern began to show in his notebook. Evening grapes, 3 wake-ups. Handful before bed, urgency. He stared at the words, frustrated. Grapes had never seemed like a threat. How can something so small make such a big mess of me? He asked aloud. Clara was the first to notice the link, too. One night, after Elias had eaten generously from the grape bowl during supper, she watched as he rose for the 3rd time before midnight. By morning, she said softly, "I think it's the grapes, love." Elias frowned, unwilling to believe it. "They're tiny," he protested. "It can't be." But deep down, he knew the truth. The sweetness, subtle as it seemed, was still sugar. And sugar, as he had already learned, had its ways of feeding inflammation, quietly stirring discomfort in the most delicate places. Dr. Hensley explained it with the same steady tone Elias had come to trust. "Grapes seem harmless because they're small," he said, "but it's easy to eat too many. The sugar adds up quickly. And tannins, the compounds that give them that little bite, can irritate your bladder lining. With your prostate already enlarged, that irritation feels magnified." Elias listened, nodding slowly. The doctor's words matched what his body had been telling him, though hearing it out loud gave the lesson more weight. Grapes, too, carried a hidden cost. At first, Elias felt betrayed. Grapes had been a part of his life since childhood, when his father grew them on a small trellis behind the house. He remembered running his hands along the vines, popping the tiny orbs into his mouth while his mother called from the kitchen window. Giving them up felt like cutting a string tied to memory. "It's like everything I loved is turning against me," he told Clara one evening, his voice heavy. She touched his arm gently. "Not against you," she said, "just reminding you to take care." So Elias tried again, not with denial, but with moderation. Instead of handfuls, he ate a small bowl earlier in the day, savoring each grape slowly. He paid attention to how his body responded, and the difference was clear. Nights grew quieter when he stopped eating them after supper. The urgency softened, his sleep less interrupted. It wasn't perfect, but it was manageable. "They don't have to leave my life completely," he told me once. "I just have to know when to stop inviting them in." The grandchildren noticed his restraint. "Grandpa, why don't you eat grapes with us at night anymore?" one asked, offering him a small bunch. Elias smiled warmly. "Because my nights matter more than my snacks," he said. The child giggled, not fully understanding, but Clara's eyes softened. She knew the courage it took for Elias to say no to old comforts, to choose rest over nostalgia. In truth, grapes became a lesson for Elias in the subtle ways of aging. It wasn't always the big choices that mattered most. Sometimes it was the small, unnoticed habits, the handfuls of sweetness, the little sips before bed, that tipped the balance. By recognizing that, he felt a growing sense of control. It was no longer about what he couldn't have. It was about what he chose to protect. His rest, his dignity, his mornings with Clara free from the weariness of a broken night. One afternoon, sitting on the porch with a bowl of blueberries, Elias reflected on the change. "I used to think wisdom came in grand lessons," he said. "But maybe it's in the little things, the tiny grapes that seem harmless until they're not. Maybe age teaches us to pay attention to what we once ignored." His words carried a calm acceptance, the kind that only comes from living through both the sweetness and the struggle. Grapes had not betrayed him. They had simply revealed another truth of his later years, that even the smallest pleasures require respect. By choosing when and how to enjoy them, Elias transformed what could have been a nightly burden into a mindful indulgence. He no longer felt captive to restlessness. Instead, he felt like a man who had learned the quiet art of balance, one grape, one choice, one night at a time. Elias had always thought of grapes as innocent, too small to carry any real weight in his health. But after weeks of restless nights that seemed to follow every evening handful, he could no longer deny the truth. Grapes, sweet as they were, had begun to leave their mark on him. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden illness, no sharp pain. It was subtler, a creeping discomfort, the kind that stole peace in the dark hours of night. And as he looked closer, as he filled the pages of his notebook with careful observations, Elias began to see the pattern clearly. Sugar and tannins together were the culprits. One evening, after supper, Clara placed a bowl of grapes on the table. Elias looked at them for a long moment before shaking his head. "Not tonight," he said softly. Clara raised her eyebrows. "Because of the sugar?" she asked. Elias nodded, then added, "And the tannins. I think that's what stings the most." His voice was steady, almost relieved to finally name what had troubled him for so long. He had once thought it was just the sweetness, but now he knew it was also the way those compounds seemed to irritate his bladder, making rest impossible. Dr. Hensley confirmed what Elias had suspected. Grapes carry a double weight for men like you, he explained. The sugar feeds inflammation, and tannins, the same compounds that give red wine its bite, irritate sensitive tissues. On their own, each might not trouble you, but together, especially in the evenings, they create the urgency you feel. Elias listened, nodding slowly. It wasn't easy to hear, but it was clarifying. For months, he had felt betrayed by something he couldn't name. Now he had words for it, and in those words, he found strength. He told me later that the realization changed the way he looked at sweetness. It's not about denying myself, he said. It's about understanding the cost. Sugar and tannins, two little things I never thought about, can take away my whole night. And once you know the cost, you can decide if it's worth paying. His words carried the weight of a man who had lived long enough to know that wisdom isn't about avoiding joy, but about choosing the joys that let you live in peace. Clara supported him with her usual quiet care. Instead of grapes in the evening, she began offering bowls of blueberries or strawberries, their sweetness gentler, their effect on him kinder. Elias accepted gratefully, though at first he missed the little pop of grapes between his teeth, the way they seemed to vanish almost too quickly. But after a few nights of steadier sleep, the longing dulled. He found that the peace of uninterrupted rest was sweeter than any handful of grapes could ever be. "This," he said one morning, stretching with ease, "is worth every trade." The grandchildren noticed the shift, too. One afternoon, his granddaughter held up a bunch of grapes and asked, "Why don't you eat these with us, Grandpa?" Elias smiled, crouching to meet her gaze. "Because they make me run to the bathroom too much," he explained gently. The girl giggled, but then nodded seriously. "So you eat the other berries instead?" she asked. Elias laughed, delighted by her observation. "Exactly. I choose what helps me rest, so I can play with you longer." In her eyes, he saw understanding, small but genuine. His choices were not just protecting himself, they were shaping how the next generation thought about listening to their bodies. What struck Elias most was how much lighter he felt once he stopped wrestling with confusion. Before, each restless night had felt like a mystery, an unsolvable riddle that stole his dignity. But now, with clarity, he no longer felt betrayed. He felt informed. Grapes weren't villains, they were simply food with a hidden edge. By knowing that, he could meet them on his own terms, choosing when and how to enjoy them without surrendering his peace. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sun set, Elias reflected with Clara. "Funny, isn't it, that something as small as a grape can hold so much power over a man?" Clara chuckled softly. "Or maybe it's not the grape," she said. "Maybe it's the lesson. The reminder that even little things matter." Elias nodded, his eyes distant but calm. "Yes," he said, "the little things always matter. In building, in living, in health, they add up." And so Elias carried forward, no longer angry at the sugar and tannins that once stole his nights, but grateful for the wisdom they had given him. He had learned to see even the smallest choices as acts of care, each one shaping the life he still wanted to live. Grapes had taught him that urgency is not just a symptom, it is a message. And in listening to that message, Elias found not just steadier sleep, but a deeper sense of dignity. By respecting the truth about sugar and tannins, Elias transformed what had once been a source of frustration into a source of clarity. He no longer felt trapped by restless nights. Instead, he felt empowered by mindful days. And in that shift, he discovered something more valuable than any fruit could offer: the quiet sweetness of peace. By the time autumn settled in, Elias had grown used to his new way of living. The notebook he once filled with frustration had become something steadier, a record of choices that brought peace rather than confusion. Each page told the story of a man who had learned to listen, who had found dignity not in denying himself, but in choosing wisely. Pineapple, citrus, bananas, watermelon, grapes, all of them still had a place in his memories. But in his present life, he found himself turning toward gentler companions, fruits that did not steal his rest or unsettle his nights. Blueberries became one of his favorites. Clara often served them in a small bowl with breakfast, their dark skins glistening in the morning light. They were sweet without sharpness, nourishing without punishment. Elias liked how they sat quietly on his tongue, leaving no sting, no urgency. "These don't fight me," he told Clara once, smiling as he spooned them over his oatmeal. "They let me be." To him, blueberries felt like kindness in a fruit, proof that not everything he enjoyed had to come with a hidden cost. Pears found their way into his afternoons. Clara would slice them thin, arranging them neatly on a plate beside his tea. Their softness reminded him of gentler times, of the orchard his uncle once tended, where he had climbed trees as a boy to pluck the ripest ones. Eating pears now felt like a return to that simplicity. They filled him without pressing, sweetened his day without robbing his night. "They don't shout like citrus," he said one evening. "They whisper." And in that whisper, Elias found peace. Apples, too, became steady friends. He rediscovered their crisp bite, the way their flavor carried freshness without the sting of acidity. Clara often baked them with a dusting of cinnamon, filling the house with a fragrance that reminded him of homecomings after long days at the shop. Apples, unlike so many of the fruits that troubled him, gave him no reason to dread the night ahead. Instead, they grounded him, reminding him that simplicity often carries the greatest comfort. The grandchildren joined in these changes without protest. They happily munched blueberries, pears, and apples beside him, often asking him to share stories about the fruits he used to eat when he was their age. "So you don't eat grapes at night, Grandpa?" one asked, chewing thoughtfully. Elias chuckled. "Not anymore, but these blueberries are just as good." They nodded, satisfied, and went back to their snack. In those small moments, Elias felt proud. His journey, once so private and painful, had become something he could pass on gently, teaching through example rather than lecture. Dr. Hensley noticed the difference too. At his next appointment, the doctor smiled as Elias described his adjustments. "That's exactly the path you should be on," he said. "Not about cutting everything out, but about finding what truly supports you now." Elias nodded, the calm in his voice reflecting the calm he felt in his body. "I used to feel betrayed," he admitted. "Now I feel partnered, like my body, and I are finally on the same side." Clara watched him with quiet pride. She had seen the frustration in his eyes months earlier, the nights when he sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. Now she saw something different: steadiness, hope, even gratitude. "You've changed, Elias," she told him one evening as they shared a baked apple by lamplight. "Not just in what you eat, but in how you carry yourself." Elias smiled, his weathered hands resting over hers. "I guess I've learned that peace is worth more than any sweetness," he said softly. What struck me most about Elias's story was not the food itself, but the transformation it sparked. He began this journey weary and ashamed, burdened by symptoms he didn't understand. But through patience, observation, and the support of those who loved him, he discovered that even small shifts could reshape his days and nights. He learned that food could be both friend and foe, but that wisdom lies in choosing the friends that nourish without harm. By swapping citrus for pears, pineapple for blueberries, grapes for apples, Elias built a new rhythm, one that honored both his body and his memories. He didn't live in fear of what he couldn't have. Instead, he lived in gratitude for what still remained. His life became a balance of memory and mindfulness, of holding close what mattered most and letting go of what no longer served him. And in the end, that is the gift of gentle fruit swaps. They aren't about loss, but about rediscovery. About learning that health is not found in clinging to the old, but in embracing the new with grace. Elias Brady, at 68, found that grace. He found it in the sweetness of blueberries, the softness of pears, the crispness of apples. He found it in the steadier nights and calmer mornings they gave him. And most of all, he found it in the peace of knowing he was no longer at the mercy of his body, but walking beside it, partner to partner, step by step. Elias Brady's journey began in the quiet hours of the night, when sleep slipped away and frustration weighed heavier than rest. At 68, he found himself at a crossroads, no longer able to ignore the signals his body sent. What seemed at first like betrayal, fruit he had trusted his whole life turning against him, slowly revealed itself as wisdom waiting to be heard. Step by step, Elias discovered that not all sweetness is kind, and not every habit deserves to be carried forward. Pineapple, citrus, bananas, watermelon, grapes, each had once brought joy, yet each also carried a hidden cost his body could no longer afford. But instead of bitterness, Elias chose awareness. With Clara's gentle support and Dr. Hensley's steady guidance, he learned to trade restlessness for peace, to swap habits that hurt for those that healed. His notebook filled with lessons written in quiet determination. Less sugar, less acid, fewer late-night indulgences. More listening, more balance, more care. In that process, Elias discovered that strength in later life is not about enduring without complaint, but about honoring the body's voice and adapting with grace. Today, Elias no longer feels betrayed by food. He feels partnered with it, nourished by fruits that whisper kindness instead of shouting urgency. Blueberries, pears, apples. His nights are calmer, his mornings brighter, his dignity restored. And so his story leaves us with this truth. Aging is not the end of freedom, but the beginning of a new kind of strength. The strength to choose wisely, to listen closely, and to live fully in the years still ahead. If you find yourself waking in the night, weary of restless hours, let Elias's journey remind you, small changes can bring great peace. Begin today. Your body is speaking. Are you ready to listen?